Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Keyboard Captivity, the Labyrinth of Loneliness. Just a beach lashed by thundering waves, an abstract place where only the seaweed moves. It is the island where no one lives, the place where obsession turns round and round on itself, with no way out. Roberto Calasso, The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony. Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward pathway had been lost. Dante, The Inferno. Hi everybody, and just to start with an immediate visual illustration of the concept of the labyrinth. And this is an idea I'm going to explore in a range of videos coming up now. And I wanted to do a relatively gentle introduction by just linking the concept of the labyrinth with the notion of loneliness, or as we'll see, solitude, as it's also been referred to. But I think loneliness is a more accurate concept to understand the labyrinth. And here you can see, just to bring people up to speed, I did a whole video on the Minotaur, calling it Instagram Instagram anxiety, and there's the thumbnail of the Minotaur on the front if you want to go back for more information, which I'll be going over a lot of the stuff in future videos anyway. But the basic story: Theseus goes into the labyrinth to kill the Minotaur, helped by Ariadne, who's the half-sister of the Minotaur. And he comes back out, helped by Ariadne's thread, this golden thread that allows him to find his way back out. But this notion of going deep into the centre of something, and the notion is also often the labyrinth is beneath the surface of the earth. It's what Jung would call an archetype. It goes deep into the human psyche. And the myth, so I think although there's a mythological story, I just think it presses all our buttons as human beings. And that's one of the things I'll be exploring today as a way of introducing. It's an incredibly layered, so quite appropriately given we're talking about a labyrinth, it's easy to get lost in all the many layers of the notion of the maze and the labyrinth. So that just this one time, like I say, to start broaching the subject lightly, we'll use the incredibly cheery topic of loneliness or solitude. And here's just another. I think this is a floor from a villa in Pompeii, so it was preserved by the volcanic ash. And it's similar to the previous image, but obviously you can see right at the centre. It was a very popular notion, a popular myth, taken from Greek times, but also in Roman times. And in future videos I'll be looking at the notion of the Roman poet Virgil, and in his epic poem, the Aeneid, there are various references, and I bring it up to modernity. So, for example, there have been links made with Christopher Nolan's film Inception. There are various subtle links to the Aeneid that are quite cleverly done. So it's not just old mythology. I'm going to try and make this relevant to contemporary times too. And what I'm going to argue is that this is what this is our labyrinth. So I'm going to suggest that the classical myth has many layers, it's incredibly rich, and it actually helps people orient themselves in the world, which I consistently argue that's what myth does. It allows you to place yourself in the world through the condensed wisdom of previous generations and this ongoing tradition that's handed down. Whereas what we have is this much emptier cyberspatial environment. And I also think it's relatively interesting to notice that in social media you have the concept of threads, but they have the exact opposite effect to Ariadne's thread that helped Theseus find his way out of the maze. Online threads just lead to more and more confusion and more antipathy and anger between people. They don't lead to any exit, they don't lead to any resolution, and anyone who's ever tried to reason with anyone on an online thread should know what I'm talking about. And here's just another visual illustration of the next video. I'm going to be talking about online trolls and how young people have become inured into this world where the window on reality has been replaced by the window of a computer screen. I just thought this image quite neatly sums up the dilemma, especially obviously in COVID times when people were forced into this scenario somewhat. So I've used this Instagram anxiety. This was the thumbnail to a previous video. And it's interesting that Latin American literature, which I'm going to be talking about today, seems the labyrinth is a recurrent theme, and the accompanying notion of loneliness or solitude. So Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Colombian writer, he wrote The General and his Labyrinth. And often, again, because of its history, I think Latin America often has these dictator-type characters, often ex-military, who look back on their lives as something of a labyrinth and a maze of events. And it's often about the emptiness of power reflecting back upon itself. And then his epic book, 100 Years of Solitude, which, if anyone's interested, Netflix have a modern adaptation of it, which is pretty good. So this is the theme, the notion of the labyrinth and solitude. And I will be looking at various, including the next one, Borges, I've referred to in the past. But I'm just giving examples now of Latin American literature I'll draw upon. So another one is Los Reyes by Julio Cortázar, who, like Borges, was an Argentinian writer. And Los Reyes is the point of view of the Minotaur. It's a short play, which I'm going to use excerpts from in future that I've had to translate myself, because the only available English translation, I don't think it was done by someone for whom English was their first language. And whilst they were proficient, I think Spanish was their first language, the translation to English really isn't very good or helpful. So I wanted to show you Los Reyes to give you a sense of how layered the notion of the labyrinth and the Minotaur is. Because you can look at it from the completely opposite angle, and in Los Reyes, the Minotaur is a gentle, decent soul. So there are so many ways of approaching the whole topic. But today what I wanted to do was look at this guy. And forgive me, all the way through I'm going to be using Spanish pronunciations of Latin American words, names. So that's the way I learned Spanish, and I just confuse myself if I try and do it the Latin American way. So Octavio Paz, The Labyrinth of Solitude. It was written in 1949, published 1950. And there are 9 essays in total, and I'm going to refer in the next video, I'm going to look at the first one, the Pachuco and Other Extremes, and in this video I'm concentrating on the 9th of the essays, The Dialectic of Solitude. But the Pachuco, just to introduce the next video, the Pachuco is an older version of what I think today would be called the Cholo, the Mexican-American gangster youth, the disaffected youth. And as early as 1950s, I think it was 1943, they had the Zoot Suit riots, which I'll talk about next time. But incredibly well-dressed rioters, a bit like, I suppose, the Teddy Boys in the English context back in the day. But he's not setting out to, but I'm going to suggest next time that the Pachuco and Other Extremes essay by Paz has really interesting relevance to the concept of online trolls, disaffected youth acting out. But arguably, online trolls, because of the anonymity and the nature of online social media, is to some extent psychologically less well-balanced than the Pachucos. But the Dialectic of Solitude is the one we're looking at today. And what I'm going to do is in the next, there'll be a few quotes coming up where I'll specify they're not by Path. And you'll see that on the quote. All the other quotes will be from Path. And they're all taken from this essay, The Dialectic of Solitude. So to start off, all men at some moment in their lives feel themselves to be alone, and they are. To live is to be separated from what we were in order to approach what we are going to be in the mysterious future. Solitude is the profoundest fact of the human condition. So he goes on to explain this, but his starting point in this essay, and I'll emphasize why I think this concept of the dialectic, in other words, the dualism. So I won't bore you, but in Hegelian philosophy, there's the thesis, the antithesis, and these two contrasting things produce a synthesis, which is a third term. So that's the notion of the dialectic. And throughout the essay, Path argues that there's this dualism at the heart of the human condition. We become aware of ourselves, but our self-awareness then makes us feel lonely. So it's inescapable, it's what the human condition is. But the argument to think about today, and especially the next video, is to what extent are the social media that surround us making the human notion of loneliness much, much worse. So this is Path's approach to all. Remember, this is written in 1950. When we are born, we break the ties that joined us to the blind life we lived in the maternal womb, where there is no gap between desire and satisfaction. We sense the change as separation and loss, as abandonment, as a fall into a strange or hostile atmosphere. Later, this primitive sense of loss becomes a feeling of solitude, and still later, it becomes awareness. We are condemned to live alone, but also to transcend our solitude, to re-establish the bonds that united us with life in a paradisiac past. Put my teeth back in. All our forces strive to abolish our solitude, hence the feeling that we are alone has a double significance. On the one hand, it is self-awareness, and on the other, it is a longing to escape from ourselves. So there are various things I could comment on here, but one is, just to re-emphasize, I don't think solitude is the English translation of the Spanish word soledad. But solitude in English has quite positive connotations. So solitude could be time spent with yourself in a reflexive, nice way. Whereas soledad, I think a better translation actually would be loneliness. In Spanish, I don't think it has the positive connotations. But this idea of the labyrinth, at the heart of the labyrinth, this is what I was saying, I'm talking about the psychological depth of the concept of the labyrinth. I think Jung would refer to it as an archetypal image, because it's atavistic, it goes to the heart of being a human. But this idea of the maternal womb, when you're in the maternal womb, the idea he's saying is that there's no gap between desire and satisfaction. You're receiving all your nourishment from your mother. The minute you leave the womb, guess what? It's a life of separation, loss, and abandonment. And this dualism, the double significance, on the one hand, it's self-awareness, and on the other, it's a longing to escape from ourselves. So how do you escape from yourself? You join a sense of community or communion, Path refers to in his essay. And arguably today, he's writing in 1949, 1950 about how modern society had lost that sense of communion so that you could escape from yourself in a positive way by joining others. Think how much worse it is now, 74 years later, with the advent of the worst named, the most inappropriately named phenomenon, social media. The very social media that drive a feeling of loneliness much more than any other technology, in the guise of providing sociability, ironically. So this is a longer quote. Solitude, the very condition of our lives, appears to us as a test and a purgation, at the conclusion of which our anguish and instability will vanish. At the exit from the labyrinth of solitude, we will find reunion, which is repose and happiness and plenitude and harmony with the world. When we are expelled from the maternal womb, we begin the painful struggle that finally ends in death. Does death mean a return to the life that precedes life? Does it mean to relive that prenatal life in which rest and motion, day and night, time and eternity are not opposites? Does dying mean to cease existing as a being and finally, definitively, to be? Is death the truest kind of life? Is birth death and is death birth? We do not know. But although we do not know, our whole being strives to escape the opposites that torment us. Everything, self-awareness, time, reason, customs, habits, tends to make us exiles from life. But at the same time, everything compels us to return, to descend to the creative womb from which we were cast out. So again, he's just emphasizing, and I've italicized and emboldened the phrase maternal womb again, because ironically, the whole notion of the computer matrix, the idea of cyberspace, matrix, the word comes from the Latin mater, for mother. And there's this obvious womb-like connotation. And just to re-emphasize all the way through this video, what I want to try and underline is arguably the difference between myths of the labyrinth and myths of going deep into the labyrinth to the center. And that's used throughout literature as a metaphor for life's journey. Because at the center of the labyrinth, when you meet the Minotaur, you're eaten up. But at the center of the labyrinth of life, you meet your maker, you die. The only solution of the labyrinth is death. So it's quite a dark, and what Path tries to look at is ways of thinking about the labyrinth more positively. So this idea of going into the womb of the earth, and I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's from, this cave is a cave from Vietnam. I think it's the world's largest cave. Han Song Doon, I think it is. Apologies to any Vietnamese if I've butchered that. And what I'm suggesting is I just think this is a beautiful image of an actual cave. But this is it's a very important trope in literature across the ages, but this is a illustration by Gustave Doré, who I've used before, of Dante's Inferno, and this is where Dante and Virgil, the Roman poet, takes him into the gates of hell that says, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." So it's a very powerful literary image. And then to give you some further context, this is it. I emphasize this origin of the word labyrinth is disputed by scholars, because if you go back into the mists of language, it's difficult to prove often etymologically, definitively where words originally came from. But at least one theory is that labyrinth was a Lydian word that arguably some scholars would say produced the word labyrinth. And the labyrinth was this double axe. So they were votive offerings, they were never designed to be used. But interestingly, one idea is that this type of axe represented, you can see if you think of both sides of it, represented the moon waxing and waning. The circular passage of the moon. Because remember, in classical times, the notion that the moon affected the tides, the waves, and was linked to the earth was a very strong notion. And I'm also pointing this out because the notion of the dualism, which I'm going to talk about in a second, but this idea that the labyrinth has more, it has dual properties, more than one property. And that's also relevant to Octavio Paz's calling his essay the dialectic of solitude, this double aspect. So this is Penelope Dube, who makes this point about the dualism of the labyrinth. Ancient and medieval labyrinths or mazes are characteristically double. They are full of ambiguity. Their circuitous design prescribes a constant doubling back, and they fall into two distinct but related structural categories. They presume a double perspective. Maze treaders, whose vision ahead and behind is severely constricted and fragmented, suffer confusion, whereas maze viewers, who see the pattern whole from above or in a diagram, are dazzled by its complex artistry. What you see depends on where you stand, and thus at one and the same time, labyrinths are single. There is one physical structure, and double. They simultaneously incorporate order and disorder, clarity and confusion, unity and multiplicity, artistry and chaos. They may be perceived as path, a linear but circuitous passage to a goal, or as pattern, a complete symmetrical design. They are dynamic from a maze walker's perspective and static from a privileged onlooker's point of view. So I chose this quote because I'm trying to emphasize the duality, and as I go along I'll try and explain more and more this notion of the dualism of the notion of solitude or loneliness, and also why the labyrinth, as Dube's pointing out, the labyrinth also has this dualistic element. And there's this doubling that I argue, and I have argued throughout this channel. The layers and the doubling is an inherent property of literature, visual art, drama, whereas the world of social media is much more unilateral, it's much more uniform, it's much more at one level. What you see is what you get. Consumerism, it tends not to have a lack of complexity, a lack of context. So to go back to why so many arguments happen in the threads online, because you don't have the adequate context. Is someone being sarcastic? Are they joking? I know you can use emoticons, but they're very poor substitutes. And there are none of these calming influences that context provide you with in normal life online, which is a very obvious thing to say, but yet people still, myself included, try and reason with people online. But this dualism of the labyrinth I think is fascinating. So to give you a very practical visual illustration, this is an actual maze designed by an artist I'm going to look at in future called Michael Urton, who was, I think he might have become naturalized American, but he spent a lot of time in America, I think. But he was originally an English artist. And he designed this maze for a very rich American millionaire. And I think it's in the Catskills, USA. But with reference to that previous quotation, this is the pattern you can see from above. And in the early images I showed you on the Roman mosaic floors, they had a pattern you could see from above. So that's an intrinsic part of the labyrinth. The symmetry and the wholeness, the completeness of the overall design. But this idea of the maze walker that Penelope Dube referred to, when you're at that level, it's a different experience. You lose the pattern, and you have the stress of trying to navigate through the actual maze itself. Suddenly you're surrounded by the walls of the maze. So again, this is from The Dialectic of Solitude. And from now on, what I'm going to do is, after every quote, provide you with an image. So industrial societies, regardless of their differing ideologies, politics and economics, strive to change qualitative, that is, human differences, into quantitative uniformity. The methods of mass production are also applied to morality, art, and the emotions. Contradictions and exceptions are eliminated, and this results in the closing off of our access to the profoundest experience life can offer us, that of discovering reality as a oneness in which opposites agree. So this is what I was pointing out, the idea that I think social media and the world of online, I can't even call it existence, but given that so many people spend so much time online, remember, again, he was writing this in 1949, publishing it in 1950. He's identifying something that other writers like the Frankfurt School, Theodor Adorno and others, it's the homogeneity of mass industrial culture. And it's only got much, much worse since the time he was writing this. So what I want to do is, from now on, I'm going to, after every quote I'm taking from Path, I'm going to show you an image that I think, an artistic image, a painting that I think illustrates the sense, the sentiment of what Path is saying. And I won't comment on the images. I'll let you. I don't want to. I think there's a resonance. I think there's a link, but resonance isn't easily defined, and I don't want to try and define what you should be thinking about the visual image. But I hope you will recognize the resonance between the image and the quotation each time. And just to save time, I'll show you the image and I'll keep stum. I'll go on to the next quotation. So without more ado, most of them, just to mention, nearly all the images I'm about to show have been used before. And I thought it might be helpful in showing these images to begin to tie together previous themes. So you'll recognize most of the images, and you should recognize the ones that I haven't used before. But I'm trying to make links to previous videos so that you'll see how a lot of these videos tie together. And despite your worst suspicions, my head isn't a complete maze of unrelated ideas. There is a thread that unites a lot of these ideas. So ironically, the next image I haven't used before, but it's very typical L.S. Lowry painting that I'm sure you'll recognize. And I won't hammer on about it, but I just, to start off, this notion of quantitative uniformity, I just think that's a great image of what this quote is trying to describe. And then another quote, love is one of the clearest examples of that double instinct which causes us to dig deeper into our own selves and, at the same time, to emerge from ourselves and to realize ourselves in another. Death and recreation, solitude and communion. But it is not the only one. In the life of every man there are periods that are both departures and reunions, separations and reconciliations. Each of these phases is an attempt to transcend our solitude and is followed by an immersion in strange environments. So this is a theme that I explored, the notion of recreation. I'd suggest this is Octavio Paz's notion of creativity, and so he talks about human love is one of the most obvious examples, but it's not the only one. All the things he lists, departures and reunions, separations and reconciliations, it's all to do with, as he says, the attempt to transcend our solitude. So in the context of this channel, art, literature, paintings, they all embrace the dualism, they all embrace the contradictions of life in order to help us transcend it. And again, sorry to belabor the point, but social media doesn't do that. And arguably, social media, to build upon the previous quotation, what it tends to do is produce more of the same, homogeneity, rather than allowing us to be genuinely immersed in strange environments. So off the top of my head, I'm just thinking of what came into my mind. The novel Moby Dick takes you into, so vividly, the experience of being on a whaler, a primitive ship coming up against leviathans of the ocean. And you get a visceral sense of what it must have been like to be on a ship like that. Whereas the best of VR doesn't give you, it might give you sensations that are literally visceral, but even the best virtual reality arguably doesn't put you in the minds of a whaler like Captain Ahab, like a novel of the grandeur and beauty of Moby Dick does. But anyway, this notion of each of these phases is an attempt to transcend our solitude and is followed by an immersion in strange environments. Again, this is all from Octavio Paz's The Dialectic of Solitude. The child must face an irreducible reality, and at first he responds to its stimuli with tears or silence. The cord that united him with life has been broken, in other words, the umbilical cord, and he tries to restore it by means of play and affection. This is the beginning of a dialogue that ends only when he recites the monologue of his death. But his relations with the external world are not passive now as they were in his prenatal life, because the world demands a response. Reality has to be peopled by his acts. Thanks to games and fantasies, the inert natural world of adults, a chair, a book, anything, suddenly acquires a life of its own. The child uses the magic power of language or gesture, symbol or act, to create a living world in which objects are capable of replying to his questions. Forgive me if I've misremembered, but I seem to remember, was it Picasso talked about trying to remember in order to be able to paint like a child? And that's what he was actually striving to do. So in some senses, great art brings back what Paz is talking about here. The child's pure engagement with reality through their imagination. We do it as children, and ironically, as we get older, we forget how to do it. And that's supposed to be a sign of maturity, when arguably it's one of the strongest elements of art. Thanks to games and fantasies, the inert natural world of adults, a chair, a book, hint hint for what's to come, anything suddenly acquires a life of its own. Language, freed of intellectual meaning, ceases to be a collection of signs and again becomes a delicate and magnetic organism. Verbal representation equals reproduction of the object itself, in the same way that a carving for the primitive man is not a representation but a double of the object represented. Speech again becomes a creative activity dealing with realities, that is, a poetic activity. Through magic, the child creates a world in his own image, and thus resolves his solitude. Self-awareness begins when we doubt the magical efficacy of our instruments. And this has reminded me, I could have used a few paintings here, but personally that quote reminded me of those artists that sadly were most damaged by their artistic ability. Because self-awareness begins when we doubt the magical efficacy of our instruments. It was their self-doubt that made them such great artists. Adolescence is a break with the world of childhood and a pause on the threshold of the adult world. Solitude is a distinctive characteristic of adolescence. Narcissus, the solitary, is the very image of the adolescent. It is during this period that we become aware of our singularity for the first time. But the dialectic of the emotions intervenes once more. Since adolescence is extreme self-consciousness, it can only be transcended by self-forgetfulness, by self-surrender. So this is for anyone out there who's unfortunate enough to have teenagers at the moment. But it's interesting, in the Ovid's Metamorphoses, the reason why the gods punish Narcissus is because he doesn't return the affection. He's much loved by both boys and girls of his own age, but he ignores them all. And I've always thought it was slightly unfair. The idea that narcissists have such a bad reputation, but all Narcissus really wanted to do was to be left alone. But for the gods, this notion of being solitary wasn't approved of. And for regulars on the channel, I don't think you'll be surprised at all. You'll probably be annoyed by the choice of the next image to illustrate this notion of Narcissus as an adolescent. Solitude is not characteristic of maturity. When a man struggles with other men or with things, he forgets himself in his work, in creation, or in the construction of objects, ideas, and institutions. His personal consciousness unites with that of others. Time takes on meaning and purpose, and thus becomes history, a vivid, significant account with both a past and future. Our singularity, deriving from the fact that we are situated in time, in a particular time which is made up of our own selves, and which devours us while it feeds us, is not actually abolished, but it is attenuated and in a certain sense redeemed. Our personal existence takes part in history, which becomes, in Eliot's phrase, a pattern of timeless moments. So this is a theme that Path begins to develop, the difference between mythical time, being involved in meaningful time, that in a certain paradoxical sense is timeless. It's the same type of time that our ancestors and their ancestors all experienced, being part of a combined communal history. And he goes on to talk about, in the forthcoming quotes, he contrasts this notion of time with chronometric time, time measured by mere clocks. And at the most basic level, this is just the difference between time as we experience it at a subjective level, when time drags slowly, or when time passes extremely quickly. That's lived time as opposed to chronometric time, just the mathematical scientific measurement of time. And Path is arguing that this type of time, the time of human tradition, is much more, as we'll see, a healthier, more organic way of living than chronometric time. But this idea, I just love this, a pattern of timeless moments, and this idea that different historical times can somehow combine in this shared time that all human beings have lived, as opposed to just this dividing up of human time into historical epochs. So that's the next image, somehow to me expresses this notion of what I think Path is talking about in this time that exceeds measured time. In an epoch of group work, group songs, group pleasures, man is more alone than ever. Modern man never surrenders himself to what he is doing. A part of him, the profoundest part, always remains detached and alert. Man spies on himself. Think of reality television. Work, the only modern god, is no longer creative. It's endless, infinite work, corresponding to the inconclusive life of modern society. Anyone who's worked in a large office should be able to relate to that. And the solitude it engenders, the random solitude of hotels, offices, shops, and movie theatres. It's not a test that strengthens the soul, a necessary purgatory. It is utter damnation, mirroring a world without exit. And I just think Edward Hopper is the obvious choice to illustrate that quote. We have been expelled from the centre of the world and are condemned to search for it through jungles and deserts or in the underground mazes of the Labyrinth. Also, there was a time when time was not succession and transition, but rather the perpetual source of a fixed present in which all times past and future were contained. When man was exiled from that eternity in which all times were one, he entered chronometric time and became a prisoner of the clock and the calendar. As soon as time was divided up into yesterday, today, and tomorrow, into hours, minutes, and seconds, man ceased to be one with time, ceased to coincide with the flow of reality. When one says, at this moment, the moment has already passed, these spatial measurements of time separate man from reality, which is a continuous present, and turn all the presences in which reality manifests itself, as Bergson said, into phantasms. Sorry, that shouldn't say turn. But this idea of losing touch with time, time being turned into phantasms. Chronometric time is an homogeneous succession lacking all particularity. It is always the same, always indifferent to pleasure or pain. Mythological time, on the other hand, is impregnated with all the particulars of our lives. It is as long as eternity or as short as a breath, ominous or propitious, fecund or sterile. This idea allows for the existence of a number of varying times. Life and time coalesce to form a single whole, an indivisible unity. And again, regular viewers will be fed up with me saying and pointing it out, but I think that a great illustration of that, or the best literary reflection of that quote, would be Proust's La Recherche de Temps Perdu. Because this idea allows for the existence of a number of varying times. That perhaps is just a brilliant one-sentence summary of Proust's whole work. Proust points out that in Search of Lost Time, that it's just a huge novel devoted to a refutation of the notion of chronometric time. But this idea, life and time coalesce to form a single whole, an indivisible unity, made me think of the following painting. So that repeats, but it goes on to say, unquestionably, the conception of time as a fixed present and as pure actuality is more ancient than that of chronometric time, which is not an immediate apprehension of the flow of reality, but is instead a rationalization of its passing. So this idea of moving beyond the rationalization of its passing, the idea of a more ancient, the conception of time as a fixed present and as pure actuality is more ancient than that of chronometric time. And of all the artists who I think sum up this notion, it's Giorgio de Chirico. I've already shown one of his paintings, but this next painting just reminds me of pure actuality that is more ancient than that of chronometric time. In myth, as in religious fiestas or children's stories, time has no dates. Once upon a time, in the days when animals could talk, in the beginning, and so on. And that beginning, which is not such and such a year or day, contains all beginnings, and ushers us into living time, where everything truly begins every instant. Through ritual, which realizes and reproduces a mythical account, and also through poetry and fairy tales, man gains access to a world in which opposites are reconciled and united. All rituals have the property of taking place in the now, at this very instant. And ritual is a topic I'm going to be looking at in future because, as Path says here, through ritual which realizes and reproduces a mythical account. It's through ritual that man gains access to a world in which opposites are reconciled and united. So rituals are a way of getting you to experience mythic time, things that are taking place in the now, at this very instant. And think of how little ritual there is in modern life. So all rituals have the property of taking place in the now, at this very instant. And this next painting always makes me think of the poignancy of the now. I think it's a very clever painting for what it suggests. In theatrical performances and in the reciting of poetry, ordinary time ceases to operate and is replaced by original time. Thanks to participation, this mythical time, father of all the times that mask reality, coincides with our inner subjective time. Man, the prisoner of succession, hence the thumbnail for this whole video, breaks out of his invisible jail and enters living time. His subjective life becomes identical with exterior time, because this has ceased to be spatial measurement and has changed into a source, a spring, in the absolute present, endlessly recreating itself. Myth and fiestas, whether secular or religious, permit man to emerge from his solitude and become one with creation. Therefore, myth, disguised, obscure, hidden, reappears in almost all our acts and intervenes decisively in our history. It opens the doors of communion. So part of, when you look at the collection of essays as a whole in the Labyrinth of Solitude, one of his consistent themes is the idea in which Mexican culture is unique for the way, in some ways, it's failed to integrate its indigenous past with the conquistadores, the colonists. And then when he talks about the Pachucos, the idea is that they've then gone. So their ambivalent culture, they have an ambivalent cultural heritage anyway. And then they've gone to America, where they're outsiders yet more. And when he talks about the indigenous culture, he describes various ways in which that culture, for all its faults, so for example, human sacrifice is a bit of a black mark, but it was all centered upon the flow of life, that the maternal womb of the earth, and Greek mythology too, the whole notion of the labyrinth, the oracles, the Delphic oracles, all these associations with life in its most mysterious essence. And arguably what Western culture has lost. And when he talks about North America, you could use North America as shorthand for the whole of Western culture when he contrasts it with Mexican indigenous culture. But except for art, Western culture is mostly premised upon not seeing ourselves as part of a source, a spring in the absolute present, endlessly recreating itself. Rather, man is the prisoner of succession, breaks out of his invisible... man, the prisoner of succession, needs to find ways to break out of his invisible jail. To be part of the absolute present. The absolute present, which I would argue is the theme of the next painting. Modern man likes to pretend that his thinking is wide awake, but this wide awake thinking has led us into the mazes of a nightmare in which the torture chambers are endlessly repeated in the mirrors of reason. When we emerge, perhaps we will realise that we have been dreaming with our eyes open, and that the dreams of reason are intolerable. And then perhaps we will begin to dream once more with our eyes closed. Well, I'll leave the next final painting, drawing, to speak to this quote without me adding my commentary. So there'll be lots more on the Labyrinth, you'll be pleased to know. So until the next time, all the very best. Bye.